let's see, we should have a few more people join us. But, how's the inner work going? How's it going with you, Karen?
I slacked off a bit.
Okay.
And got back into my groove this past week with some good sittings and some good moments of self-remembering. I do think that being invaded surgically is kind of an interesting thing to think about, my body being attacked like that. And it gave me a good substrata for self-remembering, because whenever there's a little pain or some quirky thing comes up, it's a reminder. So that's been good. I just gave myself a pass on working for for like a week. I was lazy and didn't feel like doing much, but I'm back in my groove. And
that's good. I mean, it's not laziness. It's that, there are times when we waste our energy, for instance, on negative emotions, on identification. We just don't have the reserves within us to do the inner work. And I'm sure it's very similar when you have an operation. Your body's saying, I have to focus any kind of surplus energy on bringing the healing. So you just don't have that, reserve of energy that you normally have.
Well, that's a good way to explain it.
Yeah. And also, rather than feeling guilty about it. And then also, I mean, Mr. Gurdjieff said we should only do inner work, a third of the day, or a third of our day. We spend a third sleeping, a third on inner work. And this is for advanced students. And then a third, he said, send it to the devil. We shouldn't be, from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, doing inner work. It's just not proper for the human organism. We need breaks, we need rests, we need to get into that associative mind. We need to walk around in a state of waking sleep. He said that whenever he wanted to go to sleep, he would go to the cinema and, sleep with his eyes open in the state of being awake, but just shutting down. Apparently when he went to Taliesin, Frank Lloyd Wright's retreat, architectural school, whatever it was, he insisted they go to the movies every Saturday night, just to enjoy himself and just to forget about it. I know for me, I go on Facebook and I start looking at other people's posts when I need to relax and I need to shut down.
That's a very easy way to do that.
Yeah. Guido, yourself. Oh, I think he might have frozen.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but it's still slightly distorted. And I know that you have a satellite dish, so perhaps it's the weather. How are we?
Yeah.
Do you hear us fine?
Yeah, really fine. Very good. The weather here is very bad. It's a lot of rain. I'm on the region. It's clouded with clouds, clouds with clouds. All the region, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, the north of the Brazil, Brazil, everything. Like everybody else.
Is it the rainy season there?
Yes, it's rainy season again.
Yeah. We had real winter last week. It's above freezing now, but last week during the day it was -8 on Thursday, and this is Celsius. It's not Fahrenheit. It was that's like 17 degrees Fahrenheit. But at nighttime it was down to like -12, -13. Which is very unusual weather for Toronto to have in November. January, yes. November, no. But it's warmed up again. It's above freezing. Not much above freezing, but rather than snow, we have rain now, and we had a little bit of snow last week, which for, as I said, November is very unusual. And we had a warm, hot summer. So I'm not sure if anyone else is joining us. Normally they send me Sona from Turkey said that she can't make it today. She's under the weather, feeling ill. I'm not sure what, Ian normally joins us. There must be some reason why he's not here. And, usually the others kind of tell me and let me know. But let's do an inner exercise. So let's just begin by acknowledging that we're doing all of this work on ourselves. We're not just doing it for ourselves, though we are doing it for ourselves. That's the first acknowledgement, that we are doing this work for ourselves, and that we are doing it for our fellow human beings, and that we are doing it for the earth herself. Mr. Gurdjieff says, do not become identified with the physical body. Our physical body does not belong to us. It belongs to the earth. He also says, and this is to Catherine Hulme in her little, not really a book, but Conversations with Gurdjieff, he says that we also should not be identified with our essence, because our essence is human essence. That's why we're trying to develop the real I, something for ourselves. So whenever we work, we work on these three levels, and it's always good to acknowledge it. So let's just begin by becoming aware of our breathing, sensing the flow of air in through our nose, nasal passage, back of mouth, throat, down into our lungs and back out again. To just focus on the sensation, the journey of the air in and out. And then let's focus as well on the sensation of air. Let's divide our attention further and focus not only on the journey, the sensation of air as it blows in and out. Let's also focus on the movement of the various muscles involved in breathing. The movement of the diaphragm, the muscles in the abdomen, the intercostal muscles between the ribs. So to focus on the sensation of air flowing in from our nose to our lungs and back out again, and the movement of the various muscles involved in breathing. And then let's add a third dimension and become aware of the fact that through breathing, we are feeding and cleansing our body. As we breathe in what Mr. Gurdjieff calls the second being food. And by consciously breathing, we are breathing in higher particles and more active elements in the air. So become aware of the sensation of air as it flows in and out, the movement of the various muscles involved, diaphragm, abdomen, the muscles between the ribs, and become aware of the fact that as we breathe in, we are feeding our body, and as we breathe out, we are cleansing our body. Now, the feeding our body, if we get really good at self-sensing, and we get really good at the physical awareness of our body, we can actually notice the oxygen feeding the cells in our body. We can notice this particularly in our extremities, in our hands and fingers, and perhaps in our feet and toes. And as we breathe in, perhaps you can notice it almost seems like an atmospheric flowing down, at least to my internal perceptions, flowing down around the outside of my hand, like this slow pulsing atmosphere that, when you pay attention to it, follows the rhythm of the breath and the rhythm of breathing. Now, if you pay attention to this quality, this movement of energy, you will notice that it's actually different than the quality of energy involved in sensing. To become aware of the connection between breathing in and feeding our body with oxygen and higher molecules or particles in the air, which we can notice, most especially in our hands and fingers, and then in our feet and toes. This is actually what we mean in the teachings by feeling. This is a different quality. It's something different than sensing. There's a flowingness to it. As I said for myself, I notice it almost as an atmospheric quality. So let's become aware of the sensation of air. And this is a sensation. The sensation of air flowing in and then flowing back out. Tracing the journey of the air in through our nose, nasal cavity, back of mouth, throat, vocal cord, right down into our lungs, and then tracing it back past all of those points. And then become aware of the movement of the various muscles involved in breathing. Your diaphragm is the major muscle. It's a parachute-shaped muscle that expands down your diaphragmatic cavity, which acts like bellows and pulls your lungs open, which then pulls air in. And then as it contracts back up, it causes your lungs to collapse and constrict, and it pushes the air out. And that's the main engine of breathing. But it's also directly wired into various muscles in the abdomen. So as it expands down, those muscles expand. It's also directly wired in to the intercostal muscles between our ribs. So it sends the signals to those other two groups of muscles to expand and contract in unison. So it's the real engine, the real source that controls our breath and breathing. So become aware of the sensation of air, become aware of the movement of these various muscles, and then also just become aware of the lungs expanding and contracting. Perhaps you can notice the rib cage expanding and contracting along with the movement of muscles and the sensation of air. And then begin to become aware of this feeling, this flow in your hands and fingers. Notice that it's a different quality. It's qualitatively different than sensation. As I said, I described it myself, almost atmospheric in quality. There's something different to it than sensing. And so when we talk about feeling, when we talk about becoming aware of something flowing from our lungs down to our solar plexus, this is the perception. This is that feeling, that different qualitative experience. And Mr. Gurdjieff gave an exercise with 3 fingers. This is an advanced exercise. It's in Life is Only Real Then When I Am. I'm talking about the title is a magical title. I love that title. We have to become real first, not stuck in our imagination in the state of waking sleep, and then life itself becomes real. But he said, for one finger, the head brain, for the other finger sensing, and for the other finger feeling. And this qualitatively different experience that we can actually feel in our hands and fingers as we breathe. You'll notice, if you pay attention, that there is a pulsation to this flow into our hands and fingers, and not a pulsation with the heart. It's more in line with our breathing. And this is what we have to become aware of, flowing down into our solar plexus, and then flowing from our solar plexus down into our reproductive organs. So again, let's bring our awareness back to our breath, back to our breathing, the sensation of the air flowing in through our nose, nasal cavity, back of mouth, throat, down into our lungs and back out again. The movement of our diaphragm, abdomen, the muscles between the ribs, and even the expansion and contraction of our rib cage and our lungs. Really become aware of the sensation of breath. Become aware of the whole body breathing. And as you breathe in, become aware of the fact that you are feeding your body with the second being food. Become aware of this movement this flow, this atmospheric quality, this quality that's different than sensation, going down into your hands and fingers. Now, Mr. Gurdjieff, in certain breathing exercises, also said to imagine that we are breathing out. What he said, something that was like similar to someone breathing out a cigarette. I prefer to think of it as a gray, foggy waste. To imagine that we are breathing in luminous particles, light-filled particles, the active elements of the air that we are breathing in, that's feeding our body, that's leading to feeling, and that we are breathing out a gray, foggy waste. Scientists, by hooking people up to devices that capture the out-breath and various computations and calculations, have determined that approximately 70%, 70% of the body's waste products are exhaled. So the carbon dioxide or monoxide or whatever it is that we keep in our blood and various other noxious gases that are in our blood, various other toxins and waste products in our body are actually breathed out. And so it's good to mentally represent this with our head brain as breathing out a gray, foggy, or gray, stale waste. Feeding our body as we breathe in, aware of this in our hands and fingers, and then breathing out that gray, foggy waste. Now let's just allow our attention to rest. And we're just going to do Mr. Gurdjieff's filling exercise. As a vessel fills with warm golden honey, imagine filling with sensation from the bottom of our feet and slowly filling up to the top of our head. And I remember the first time I was in a group and we did this, I just said, this is all imagination, I can't really do it. And then, revisiting the exercise a decade later, I was actually surprised at how I was then able to do it. So even if you have to sort of fake it in your mind or whatever, if you're watching this on YouTube and you're new to this, you practice this enough and you begin to notice and you begin to control the flow of sensation up your body. So just become aware of the bottom of your feet, sensing the bottom of your feet. And then as a vessel fills with warm golden honey, sense your feet filling with sensation. And then filling with sensation from the bottom of your feet up through to your ankles, and feel the sensation arising up through your lower legs, up through to your knees, up through slowly your upper legs. And as the sensation, as this filling reaches your hips, allow it to also enter your hands. So feeling the sensation from the bottom of your feet rising up through your hips and hands into your lower torso, so your lower back, your abdomen, your lower arms, filling with sensation up to your midriff, your solar plexus, your middle back, your elbows, filling with sensation up further, moving up your upper torso, up your chest, up your upper back, your upper arms, up to your shoulders. And filling with sensation from the bottom of your feet all the way up to the base of your neck. And then filling and feeling the sensation rising up your neck to the base of your skull, and then rising up through your skull, up to the very top, the crown of your head. And sense your whole body. Sense your whole body from the bottom of your feet all the way to the top of your head, sensing your body as one organic whole, aware of your body, the sensation of self. And while remaining aware of your body, while remaining aware of the sensation of self, and just as an aside, Mr. Gurdjieff said that sensation should rise up from the feet to the top of the head, and relaxation go from the top of the head down to the bottom of the feet. So if we try to relax ourselves, we should start at the top. But if we want to fill with sensation, we should begin at the bottom. Though the ultimate goal is to be able to sense your body in an instant, just to be present in your body. And so a lot of ways that mindfulness, and particularly the self-sensing variety of mindfulness, is taught is a little wrong, because they get people stuck on body scans and various different things. They don't have them building to a more and more and more and more complex, holistic awareness of our body, and to realize that this is the end game for sensing. It's to sense our organic body as one whole, or what Mr. Gurdjieff called the sensation of self. Most important awareness, the sensation of our self, because a lot of other inner exercises are all predicated on the ability to hold this in second position. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I've talked about that in previous sessions. So just become aware of your physical body. Become aware of the sensation of air flowing in, the movement of your diaphragm, abdomen, the muscles between your ribs, your lungs and rib cage expanding and contracting. And just pay a little bit of attention as you breathe in to that atmospheric quality, that something different that you can notice in your fingers. And now we're going to involve the head brain, the words and picture maker. Mr. Gurdjieff said that we have two different types of mentation. Mentation by thought, which he meant the associative mind, the words that flow around in our mind, and mentation by form, which is visualizing, sensing, smelling, hearing, tasting. The mentation by form isn't purely picture. It involves the full sensory awareness of what we can become aware of in our imagination. And so I want us to use that part of the brain to imagine, and this is just a metaphor, but I like this metaphor, to imagine breathing in sparkles of luminous light, to imagine breathing in luminous higher particles as we breathe in, and then breathing out that gray, foggy waste. So this is to keep the head brain occupied, to involve the head brain in this exercise. So imagine breathing in the active elements of the air, and then breathing out a gray, foggy waste, perhaps representing these active elements as sparkles of light, or however you would like to represent them in that part of your brain that thinks in pictures and forms and senses and, sound and touch and taste and hearing. Breathing in the active elements of the air, and then breathing out that gray, foggy waste. And then let's combine these two. Imagine breathing in the active elements of the air, the particles of light perhaps, while sensing your whole body. And then breathing out that gray, foggy waste while sensing your body. Breathing in those particles, higher particles, sensing the movement of your diaphragm, abdomen, the muscles between your ribs, sensing your body breathing. Breathing out that gray, foggy waste. And then, as we imagine breathing in those particles of light, or however we want to represent it, and breathing out the gray, foggy waste while sensing our body, as we breathe in, bring your attention to your hands and fingers. and become aware of that other quality that arises in your extremities that you can really notice. Maybe you can also notice it in your feet and toes. Breathing in the particles of light, sensing your body, breathing out the gray foggy waste, sensing your body, and becoming aware of feeling in your hands and fingers, and perhaps in your feet and toes. And then let's do our best to move this awareness of feeling as we breathe in. Try your best to become aware of this feeling flowing down into your solar plexus. And then as you breathe out, imagine it flowing down towards your reproductive organs. Breathing in and feeling this quality in your solar plexus, and as you breathe out, it flows down. And if it's a little difficult, you can just focus on your hands and fingers and really familiarize yourself with the qualitative difference between feeling and sensing. As I said, it's easiest to feel feeling in our hands and fingers, but we ultimately want to feel it flowing into our solar plexus from our breath, which is the seat of our conscious awareness. And this is where real work begins, flowing into our solar plexus and then down to our reproductive organs. Now I can get much more complex, but I don't want to. This is very complex for a lot of people. But those who have been in the work, maybe I will get a little bit more complex. As we breathe in, we can become aware of this feeling flowing down into our solar plexus. And as we breathe out, we can become aware of it flowing to our reproductive organs. But not all of it flows down to our reproductive organs. A part of it remains in our solar plexus. And something even higher arises from perhaps behind the navel, from deep in the navel. A higher quality arises that flows to the solar plexus and meets with what remains in the solar plexus, what didn't flow down to the reproductive organs. And then this creates another alchemical process. And part of this, the higher part, then also flows down. So we can get a little complex. Some of you who will be watching this on YouTube will be novices. This will be beyond your experience. Others won't be novices. And this is something else to try. So as we breathe in, to become aware of this feeling that flows down to our solar plexus. And as we breathe out, to become aware that a part of this feeling flows down to our reproductive organs and another part stays in our solar plexus, and something higher flows up from behind our navel and meets with this higher substance and creates another alchemical process where the higher blends with the lower to meet in the middle, and this then flows down. And this is part of an exercise that came from George Addy, one of Mr. Gurdjieff's students. And it was recorded in the late 80s. But as I said, the advanced part of the awareness of something flowing up and then intermingling with what is left in the solar plexus and then flowing down is beyond a lot of people's capability, but various different people are watching these videos, various different levels. So, if you can try that, do not harness your imagination. Do not imagine it. This is something you have to feel. It's a qualitative feeling. So let's just bring our awareness back to the sensation of air. The sensation of air flowing in and the movement of the various muscles, the diaphragm, abdomen, the muscles between the ribs, the sensation of the lungs inflating and deflating, the rib cage expanding and contracting. Become aware of the sensation of self in the context of breathing. And then begin to again imagine as we breathe in, we're breathing in these particles of light. And as we breathe out, we're breathing out gray, foggy waste. So with our head brain, the imagination of breathing in these active elements, luminous elements, qualities in the air, and with our head brain, imagine that we are breathing out a gray, foggy waste. And then with the sensation of self, the sensation of our body, being aware of the movement of the muscles, the sensation of our body as one organic whole involved in breathing. And then add this third process, bring all three centers to bear. So as we breathe in, imagine something from our lungs goes down to our solar plexus. And then as we breathe out, imagine it flows down to our reproductive organs. Breathing in with all three centers, the imaginative head brain, the sensation, and aware of this feeling. And then as we breathe out, breathing out with all three brains. And I'm going to end it here. I could, involve the I am and other things that I've done in other exercises, but, this is an important thing to do, to learn how to extract the higher particles in the air, to learn to begin to distinguish feeling from sensation. Mr. Gurdjieff said, one sitting with this conscious three-brained awareness of breathing is equivalent to a month's work. Because in order for us to grow our being, the higher has to blend with the lower in order to meet in the middle. And he said that the problem with most people is they do not have the requisite and the necessary higher substances inside them to meet with the lower in order to blend into the middle. And this is a way of hacking into that process. By consciously breathing, by breathing with our head brain, our body brain, and our feeling brain, we are actually drawing these higher particles into ourself that can help to accelerate our inner work. I personally know that I would have loved to have been taught this back in 1981 when I first became a student of the teachings. I think it would have accelerated my development by perhaps decades, just understanding this little particular aspect of conscious breathing with conscious awareness. Now, it's always important to finish inner work with two things. The first is the collected state exercise. And we have an atmosphere surrounding ourselves. Now, Mr. Gurdjieff said that if we think of our mother, our atmosphere can actually be dispersed in the direction of our mother, even if she's on the other side of the world, or perhaps she's not even in this world. Our atmosphere goes towards what we become identified with, what we think about. It can also be disturbed by our sensations and by our feelings. So our atmosphere can be, like a factory belching smoke on a windy day, and the atmosphere is just blowing all away. And he said we have to learn to contain this atmosphere. We have to learn to collect it. And for the normal person, there are three ways that we disturb our atmosphere. We disturb it through our thoughts and associations. We disturb it through our feelings, and we disturb it through our sensations. So do your best to just keep your body tranquil, to keep your thoughts tranquil, to just keep your feelings tranquil. Keep your atmosphere calm. Keep your atmosphere quiet. Try to contain your atmosphere within about a meter, meter and a half, which is 4 to 6 feet. So, not too far in front and not too far behind or on the sides. Try to become aware of the boundary of your atmosphere. Keep it tranquil, keep it still, keep it calm, keep it contained around you. Aware of the boundary of your atmosphere, keeping it collected. This is called the collected state exercise. And then in a moment, I'm going to count to 3. And when I get to 3, just breathe it in. And then breathe normally. Breathe it in and imagine something remains from your atmosphere as you breathe out. So keep your atmosphere tranquil, calm, serene. Become aware of its boundary. Very clearly notice it has a boundary around you. Keep it collected around you. And then 1, 2, 3. Breathe your atmosphere in and then just breathe out. And as you breathe out, as Mr. Gurdjieff said, imagine something remains. Something that then coats. Something within inside ourselves that allows us to grow our being. Mr. Gurdjieff said that we are born with a physical body. But metaphorically, and this is my metaphor, it's like we are born with a fully developed physical body. We have an emotional body, the Kesdjan body, the astral body, that is like a 28-week-old fetus. Not quite viable. It still needs the womb. It still needs the physical body. And then we are also born with the intellectual or the higher being body, almost just as an embryo, maybe as a zygote. And the work consists in growing our Kesdjan body, our astral body, our emotional body, and then also growing our intellectual body so that they are both capable of surviving without the protective layer of our physical body. So this is what we are doing with this inner work. We are growing our Kesdjan body, our astral body, our emotional body, and ultimately we are growing our intellectual body. And we do this through inner work. So this breathing in of our atmosphere after we do inner work and maintaining this collected state, allowing the emanations to settle, and this is Mr. Gurdjieff's phrase, allowing the emanations to settle within us is how we begin to grow our being. Now, in your mind, silently repeat after me. May results from this exercise be transubstantiated within me for my being. And then, just, when we do this at home, if we can try to just maintain the collective state to make sure that, not only do we say sit for 20 minutes in the morning, but we allot half an hour for our inner work. And so we do the 20 minutes of sitting, and then we spend the next 10 minutes just in a calm, collected state, allowing, these energies, these substances within us to coalesce in the proper way and crystallize us in the proper way. Any comments, any questions, any concerns? No? Any comments, Karen? I'll put you on the spot.
Well, that's very interesting because I never really understood the difference in the sensing and feeling in my hands and feet. And I I understood that now. I have always had those two sensations, but I always thought they were sensing.
Yeah.
And now I get the feeling part is more like a heat thing
Yeah.
that I always thought was higher sensation. So that
Yeah.
was a very interesting point to
Yeah.
understand. And all that you've spoken about from last week too, about breathing in the sparkles of light in the air, I've been working with that all week. So what you're saying today had more, what would I say, compounding what you said last week. So that's been good. Thank you.
You're welcome. And you know, the sparkles of light is a metaphor. It's an imaginal, it's something from the head brain. And that's mine. I mean, we could also say, for instance, imagine sparkles of light, and not just the visualizing aspect of our head brain, because, you know, he called it mentation by form. We can all, right now, for instance, we can, in that interview finder in our mind with our eyes open, we can imagine that we can see a red rose. But we can also imagine that we can breathe in the scent of a rose. This is also part of that imaginative faculty of our brain. So I'm not really a visual person. I'm more kinesthetic, more auditory. I'm very perceptive of accents, but that's my background. Travel, you know, being born in Africa, living in England, coming to Canada, I was very auditorily sensitive. But, you know, we don't just necessarily have to imagine breathing in sparkles of light. We can imagine breathing in this delectable higher scent. So, you know, however we want to represent the higher particles, the active elements in the air we breathe. And to be honest, just to represent them with the visual image is, in a sense, a little bit limited. If we could represent them with a higher scent, perhaps incense we may have smelt in an Orthodox church, or something that we associate with a higher, more mystical quality. And perhaps, you know, if we can imagine what angelic music may be like, or music on a harp, and breathing in and trying to, as fully and as completely, use that faculty of mentation by form. It's just easiest for most people to just represent it as sparkles of light, but we can get very complex if we want. Basically, we want to involve all of our brains, our head brain, our body brain, and our feeling brain in this process. So when we breathe with all three brains, all three centers, all three parts, we are actually mining the substance. We are extracting these higher elements from the air. And it will, and if we begin our day with it, it will facilitate our ability to remember ourselves throughout the day, and our ability to be present and to be here now in this moment throughout our day, because we are breathing in those higher particles that we need for the alchemical process. Why don't I, you know, seeing as though we're on this topic, I'll bring something up. Just to, where is it? You just give me 1 second. You know, my dad was a scientist, and people quite often say, "Oh, you know, you're too much in the head center," and you know, it's hardwired into me. Just whoops, how am I share screen? Years ago, back in 2003, 2004, I went to sleep with the food diagrams as found in Search of the Miraculous beside my bed, taped to the wall. And so it would be the last thing I would look at night, the first thing I would look at in the morning. And I did this for a few years, and then I began to play with those diagrams and the theory behind it. And this is what I came up with. This is just another way of representing the same, diagram, the same food diagrams found in chapter 9 of In Search of the Miraculous. Over on the left is the state of waking sleep. This is the normal man, mechanical man, habitual man, automatic man. We all spend time in the day in this state. Mr. Gurdjieff said that even an awakened man, even someone who is conscious, moves up into consciousness throughout the day and then back down and experiences the full range. And he said there are 4 levels of consciousness. Sleep, our normal state, waking sleep, then the level of personal consciousness, which can also be called mindfulness, and the awakened state, objective consciousness. And he said even an awakened person experiences all 4 of those states. The difference between an awakened person and someone who only lives in the lowest level of waking sleep is they only have access to 2 states of consciousness, sleep and waking sleep, whereas the awake person has access to all of them. And this is a rule of thumb that I have, is if someone says they're awake all the time, then it's probably their imagination, and it's probably a distortion of their emotional center. And we go through all of these states, and to think that we don't, to think that we just wake up and then that's it. And so I'm thinking of people like Eckhart Tolle and some of the other people who claim that they're fully awakened, enlightened beings, and they're always in the awakened state. From my understanding through these teachings, there's something wrong with what they're saying. So when I want to go into the state of waking sleep, I go on Facebook. As I said earlier, Mr. Gurdjieff said that he would go to the cinema, people sleeping with eyes wide open. When Mr. Gurdjieff, we don't realize what the other things that he did. He used to open restaurants and then sell them. He was a masterful cook. He had an eyelash factory where he employed Dushka Howarth and some of his other biological daughters and other people. And he also spent a lot of time appraising antiques. And he said that when he had to do work, in other words, dollar business work, he was half asleep. In other words, he would go down to the level of personal consciousness. When he wanted to go to sleeping with his eyes open, he would go to the cinema. And when he was with his students, I'm pretty sure he was in the state of objective consciousness, that awaking state. So this is the range of our experience. But if you notice on the left where my cursor is, let me see, I can bring... so over here, where I'm circling, not very well, this is the normal human. We get up to me 48 in the octave of air, which is this one right here. We're not really able to develop this higher because we don't have that higher particle that we need in order to create this upward movement. And I'm circling it right now in the middle diagram. I mean, in chapter 9 of In Search of the Miraculous, these are called carbon. So he would say, the body needs to already have present within it carbon 6 in order to meet with the upward movement of the octave of air. And ultimately, we want to have this So-12 in us. So-12 has an effect on Me-12. So to move over to the third diagram, So-12 has the effect to help transform Me-12, which then has the effect to help transform C-12. So this is all part of the end game that we're working towards. But through conscious breathing in the middle diagram, the level of personal consciousness, we can also use the term mindfulness, which people understand for the state. Through the breathing and through the exercise that we did, and through that any kind of three-brained conscious breathing, and to become aware of the arising of feeling, we are breathing in this particle that then allows the octave of air to move up. So in terms of the alchemical process, the alchemical transformation, this allows our emotions to develop. And this actually brings us to what I wanted to talk about today. Last week, I was introducing the concept of self-observation. And Mr. Gurdjieff said it's very important to begin to develop, he didn't quite use the word taste, but it's almost like a taste, to begin to develop the ability to discern between the activity of our intellectual center, the activity of our physical center, and our physical center is broken into two components, moving and instinctual at this, in terms of this beginning self-observation, and then to begin to discern the activity of our emotional center. And he described how when our intellectual center is working, it works through comparisons. And so with the group that I work with on Tuesday, the live group, I actually took it a little step further, and I told them, go to the supermarket. So rather than just being aware and trying to sort these different experiences that we have into different categories, I said, go to the supermarket, go to the produce section or whatever, and say, now I am going to compare and to actively exercise the head brain. So to compare this apple with this apple. This one has a bruise, it has a little black spot, this one doesn't. That's an aspect of the head brain. To become aware. I like green apples, my favorite, Granny Smith. The color green, the sensation, because there's a little bit of wax. Usually in Canada, Granny Smith apples actually come from South Africa. So they have a little bit of wax on them to help preserve them. There's a distinctive touch. And that's not so much, the sensation is actually part of my instinctive center. So the feeling in the tips of my fingers is an instinctive phenomenon. The green, that light colored green that I see is an instinctive phenomenon. But reaching for the apple, grasping the apple in my fingers, that movement is part of my moving center. So to pick up two apples, my moving center is involved. My instinctive center is involved in the awareness of the color of the green and the awareness of the touch, of the texture, of the slight waxy surface on the apples. My intellectual center is involved in comparing the two apples. Which one has a bruise or has a brown spot or whatever. And then, if I can, perhaps to recall that pleasing feeling that for me goes right back to childhood. My mother was born in Cape Town. My mother was a South African. That's why I like Granny Smiths, because she loved them because they came from South Africa. And so there was an emotional quality. And so he said the intellectual center works with comparison, which is, this one's got a bruise, this one doesn't. The moving center is the movement of our muscles, the wrapping of my fingers around the apple. The instinctive center is the awareness of the texture of the apple, the color of the apple. And the emotional center is to recall the pleasing element, the emotional element, that pleasure, that pleasing on an emotional level that came from those apples, because they are connected through my whole life back to my childhood. And so the intellectual center compares. The emotional center, it is either pleased or displeased. It's a feeling, pleasure, or not pleasure so much, and pain, because that can be an instinctive phenomenon, but pleasing and displeasing. And the moving center is the muscles involved, and the instinctual center is the the touch, the color, the shape, the form, and to try to begin to exercise this awareness. So Mr. Gurdjieff said we should become aware of what center is operating right now. And that can be a little overwhelming, particularly for new people to the work. So we can set up these situations. A grocery store is a great place to do it, particularly the produce section, to go and compare produce. But we can do it in other places. We can do it when we're eating. We can involve the comparison, and then we can involve, is this pleasing or displeasing at an emotional level, and we can involve the moving center, and we can differentiate the moving center from the instinctual center. And so by doing this, we are giving these parts of our brain sort of an active workout, and we are training ourselves at an inner level to become aware of these different aspects by consciously manipulating them. It's like lifting up a weight consciously so that we begin to notice these things. And by doing it this way, we will begin to notice, oh, I'm making a comparison. Or, oh, that doesn't make me feel good. That's displeasing. I don't like that. And we will begin, it will give us a sort of an added advantage in terms of being able to do this self-observation. Now, the other thing that I noticed last week was that we got into feeling. Karen got into feeling. Jonathan, who's not here, also got into feeling. But then Jonathan's been interested in reading about the teachings. He's 23 now. I think it's over the last 7 years. It's sort of become an idea fixe within him. And Karen, you've been involved in these teachings for a while, and same with you, Guido. And so, a higher understanding or a higher level of questioning, which is our emotions. Mr. Gurdjieff talked about something which he, Uspensky translated In Search of the Miraculous as our chief feature or our chief fault. Sort of the psychic nexus around which our personality revolves. And this, they don't really go too much into the explanation of it because he was presenting these ideas at an introductory level to Uspensky back in Russia between 1915 and 1919. But this chief fault, this chief feature within ourselves is emotional. We are broken in an emotional way. And so to pay attention, to observe this emotion is a very important part of the work. Last week, Karen, you talked about that judgmental aspect in your mind that brought up a certain feeling. And which came first, the judgmental aspect or the feeling? are they so interrelated? And, you know, as I said last week, the judgmental aspect probably goes back to your childhood, and you affirm that. You know, the voices that we hear directed to us as children, we internalize as a protective mechanism. You know, if someone's always saying, you're stupid, you're a loser, we begin to say, I'm stupid, I'm a loser, because then what is said to us doesn't hurt us as much. It's a protective mechanism. But this protective mechanism then starts out as a fortress and it becomes a prison. It becomes something that we get trapped in. And there are feelings associated with this. That's why these thoughts start out as a protective mechanism, because they protect us from a quality of feeling that we felt as children. So it wasn't the word, you're a loser, I can't believe how much you're a loser, I can't believe how stupid you are. As the child, that would evoke a real negative feeling. And so to protect us from feeling that feeling, we develop this armature of these words in our mind, but the feeling is still there. And it's the feeling we have to get towards, that we have to begin to heal. So for people who are new to the work, to focus on the categorizations. Is this a thought? Is this my intellectual center? Is this my physical center? So is it moving or instinctual? Is this my emotional center? Is it pleasing or displeasing? It's something to work on, and it's something that we can all work on. I go to the supermarket in the last week and I start comparing and I become aware of these different things, because it's always good to bring that up into the conscious awareness. But observing our emotions. Where are we broken? Is there a negative emotion that is behind the negative thoughts? Is there something that we've kind of pushed away, that we've tried ignoring, that we've tried distracting ourselves from? People, for instance, who are addicts, and it doesn't matter if it's addicted to cocaine or heroin or alcohol, or addicted to sex or addicted to gambling. There's an emotional component. There's an emotion that arises, and the subconscious mind deals with that by pushing it away, by masking that emotion with the addictive behavior. So dealing with people, for instance, with addictions, my number one focus as a hypnotherapist is to try to figure out what are the underlying emotions that the addiction is pushing away. But, we don't have to be addicts to have this underlying emotion that we kind of push away. And when we exist in the level of waking sleep, when we're mechanical man, when we just live in that slave-like world of associations and we're not really present, these emotions are there and we're not really that aware of them. And other people are, you're just such an angry person, or I can't believe how depressed you are, or whatever. Other people have an ability to perceive these emotions better than we do. But when we step up to that level of personal consciousness, we then begin to develop an acute awareness, a mindful awareness of these emotions. And just as an aside, this is a place where Ouspensky did not spend enough time with Mr. Gurdjieff, because he made essence and the level of essence seem like the promised land. Whereas J.G. Bennett said the level of essence is a very reactive emotional state. So real, powerful emotions. You can experience despair and depression at the level of essence. And it is so painful, because there is that self-reflectivity, that awareness of it. So there's a mindless level of depression, a mechanical level of depression, and there can be that mindful, personally aware, self-reflective depression that can be so painful. But we're never stuck in one state. Our feeling always changes. And at the level of the mindful awareness, personal consciousness, feelings come in duality. Mr. Gurdjieff's enigmatic phrase where he talks about the 3 levels of love. The middle level is the mindful, personally conscious level, the 3 levels of hope, the 3 levels of feeling. The middle level is not the ideal level. We want to experience those at the conscious level. What he's talking about and demonstrating in that is, the reactivity, the fact that when we are in that world 48, that mindful state, that state of personal reflectivity, it has this emotional volatility. And the further we've done the work, the more we go along the path of the work, the more we come in contact with this emotional state. And I should also say, it's not a single emotional state. There's my dog barking. It's like an onion. There's a major one, and when we peel that one off and we deal with that one, we'll find there's an underlying one. And when we peel that one off, we'll find that there's an underlying one. The Trinity, the triangle, is the dominant blueprint of the universe. And the head-brain emotion is more cerebral, it's love. The body-brain emotion is more physical, it's fear. The feeling-brain emotion is more feeling, and it's despair. So, love in the head brain, peace in the body brain, and joy in the feeling brain, or anger in the head brain, fear in the body brain, and despair in the feeling brain. And this is better understood in terms of the Hindu concept of gunas, where they say everything is composed of 3 gunas, and one is dominant, the next is less dominant, and the third is least dominant. And we're speaking of the gunas when we talk about the intellectual, the physical, and the emotional. In Hinduism, they call them sattva, which is the intellect, rajas, which is the body, the physical, and or tamas, the body, and the rajas, the more emotional. So when we take away the dominant one, the other 2 will still be there. They will need to be healed. Then we take away the next one, and we'll still have one underneath. So this is a lengthy journey, but to become mindful of the dominant negative emotion in our life is a very important dimension of self-observation, to really pay attention to that. For me, my dominant emotion was anger, even though it was masked. When I think about my childhood, I was a very angry boy. My brother was very close in age to me, and I learned, before the age of 5. I remember being incandescent at the age of 4. And it was the only way I could stop him from bullying me. And he was only 5 years old. So there's no way I can blame him at all for his behavior. We were too close together in age. They say if you want to prevent sibling rivalry with your children, space them about 3 years apart. That way they will have, time to develop their self, and there will be a big enough age gap. My brother and I, we were like 18 months apart. And so anger. And then at a certain point, I learned to suppress the anger. So it was an anger unexpressed and seething inside me. So, we can express the anger or we can suppress the anger. And I had, in my teenage years and adult, I had learned to suppress it. And so I had to bring it up. I had to heal it. I had to really work on anger. And then when I dealt with the anger, Then fear came up, and fear in the form of anxiety, fear, then it was like, what's this? Why, I thought I had dealt. And then when I dealt with the fear, depression came up and despair. So, it's like we've got these three different layers, and there's a dominance to them. So, those of you, Guido got involved in the work in 1979. I'm not sure how long you've been involved in, Karen, but you've been involved in quite a long time. To begin to observe your emotions, to begin to, what is that emotion? What have I been pushing down? What have I been trying to ignore? What is the dominant negative emotional temperature of my life? And this is another place where Ouspensky didn't quite get it right, because he said negative emotions are absolutely useless. It's only 99.9% of them. Certain negative emotions have a precognitive function. But if we pay attention to the negative emotion, we will find hidden and buried at the bottom of the negative emotion is the ego. And in despair, like the ego, I don't want to be here, I hate my life, I wish I was dead. That's actually an attribute, a phenomenon that comes from the ego, because it's concerned with me, me, me. We think of something like suicide, a state of extreme annihilation, and it's actually a very egocentric, subjective, me, me, me state. I can't stand the pain. I don't want to be here. We don't realize how involved the ego is in that. But the ego's involved in all the other negative emotions, the anger. How can they do that to me? Don't they know who I am? Or whatever, how it manifests. So these negative emotions within our life, at the core of them is the ego. And actually at the core of them, because the ego and the taste of the ego, these are all manifestations of the misuse of C12, or sexual energy. So wherever you find the ego, wherever you find that me, 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 and it can be intellectual, I want to conquer that mountain, I want to be this or that. The ego is involved in that, the ego is involved in all negative emotions. So to look for this emotion, to realize the nature of the ego, to begin to observe it. And when we begin to observe it, it is like shining a ray of light on it. Mr. Gurdjieff said, when we begin self-observation, do not try to change anything. Do not expect change. And then he also says that when we begin to observe ourselves, when we begin to do this, it is like shining a ray of light on ourselves, and we cannot help but change as a result of this light coming into these darker regions within us. So, he says, don't try to change, but change will happen, even if you don't try to change, and even if you don't know how to change. So just by becoming aware of these emotions, by becoming aware of the particular forms of darkness, the particular negative emotions, which are actually a form of emotional identification, which ultimately involve the misuse of C12, which ultimately mean that they are manifestations of our ego, will begin to slowly allow things to change. Now, there are ways to accelerate this change. This is what I do as a hypnotherapist, through age regression and taking people back to their childhoods, particularly where they got broken emotionally and beginning to heal. But one of the things that Mr. Gurdjieff did was he took a vow not to use hypnosis with his students. So we can actually work through these through hypnosis in a much quicker fashion. But when I worked through some of these myself, I wasn't able to hypnotize myself. I had to work through them to bring them up, to get the taste of them, to really become mindful of them. And then we can do things like opposite to emotion, because, you know, every act or every feeling of dislike is exquisitely balanced by a feeling of like. We are like levers, and every stick has two ends. So even though you may think you're stuck in anger, you've experienced love. You know what love feels like. The way I look at it, it's like a lever, and the lever is supposed to swing fully. And Mr. Gurdjieff also said that buffers are created, they're mechanical contrivances that are mechanically created through the misuse of C12. And I think of a buffer as like the fulcrum in a lever. So when the fulcrum is over at one side, this part of the lever is really balanced with this part of the lever. So we may experience this much anger and this much love, but we don't experience just pure unadulterated anger. And we have to learn to remove that buffer and to begin to balance love and anger. I meet a lot of people and they say, I want to be happy. And I go, oh, really? You want to get stuck in a state of happiness? So that when you're at a wedding, you're happy? Oh, yeah, yeah. And when you're at a funeral, you're happy? And no. We want happiness and sadness to be balanced. The only reason we know what happiness is because we've experienced sadness. It's a continuum from one end to the other. We want to have the range of emotions, and we want to realize that when we are happy, this is balanced with sadness. And when we are sad, this is balanced with happiness. We don't want to, just become good. Mr. Gurdjieff told Fritz Peters it's possible for a human being to become good, but it's abnormal. He said we grow between positive and negative. We grow between good and evil. The idea is not to be good and not to be the saintly person. Our goal is to awaken, and we awaken by moving up between the polarities. In other words, we awaken by moving towards the center. So happiness and sadness, despair and joy. It's moving between them, being in the reconciling position, ultimately being able to hold both of them together. So to become aware of what this negative emotion is within ourselves is a very important step. And then to become aware of the polarized opposite of this state, to perhaps recall moments when, say, we felt joy, we felt happiness, we felt those emotions. And then ultimately, we want to be able to try to hold both of these together at the same time, to feel a despair on the one side and to feel a joy on the other, and to hold them in this balance, this state of equilibrium, where we are in the reconciling position and we are above them. But this is a very advanced goal. So for a lot of you, it's just enough to become aware of what negative emotions plague your life. What is the dominant negative emotion that plagued your life? And for me, it was actually suppressed anger. It was anger unacknowledged. I remember when I did that, I must have been, I think, around 10 years of age. And I was so angry. I broke everything in my room. And then when I calmed down, I thought, why did I do this? I love that toy. I love that, thing. And I had broken it all. And that's when I went from expressing the anger to suppressing the anger, and then redirecting it inwards and holding it in and pretending it wasn't there, even though it was there. So to begin to take the emotional temperature of our life, particularly the egocentric emotion. And although I've talked about negative emotions, underneath is the ego. The ego can also be under positive emotions. Oh, I'm such a good person. And if the ego's there, it's the misuse of C12. It is just as wrong as the negative expression. But, we begin to heal this, and we begin the journey after we've started to really do the work on ourselves, step up into the mindful level by trying to figure out that dominant negative feeling, naming it. Before we can tame it, we name it. Naming is an act of mindful awareness. So we actually have to step back from the emotion and say, what am I feeling? And then to begin to develop the taste for the ego lurking underneath that emotion, or perhaps like a puppet master, the ego controlling that emotion, and to realize the ego is not necessarily just strutting down and bragging. The ego is that me, my subjectivizing particle or principle within us, that everything is what's in it for me. And, we realize that suicide most often is an act of extreme egotism. So what we think of as ego is so much more than that. It's the, what's in it for me? Me. Okay, I've talked a lot. Any comments, any questions?
Allan, what you said to me last week when I admitted about my the emotions that I had when I realized how much I was judging and criticizing in my mind. And you said, look at the ego behind that. I looked at the ego behind the judgment and the me judging, and it all came out to be the same ego pointlessly doing that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just you're pointing it out to me was really important, and I'm able to get a more interesting perspective on that aspect of my internal dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Gurdjieff, to see us not in a pupil's journey, said the ego is an absolutely important part of ourselves, and that we should never, for a normal person who lives in the level of waking sleep and has only access to the two levels of consciousness, we should not try to get them to work on their ego, because it protects them. The twin sentinels of Monsieur Self-Love and Madame Vanity. But when we step on the path, the ego becomes our biggest obstacle. And that's when we have to become aware of just how its tentacles reach into everything we do. And it's behind those thoughts, and it's behind those feelings. And as I've said, the ego is actually fueled by C12. And, that ego, it's the misuse of C12. And I just briefly before we go, C12 is also instrumental in developing the sensation of self. So in the moment that we are fully aware of the sensation of ourself, in the moment we are aware of our whole body from the bottom of our feet to the top of our head, side to side, front to back, inside to out, outside to in. The moment we are fully in the sensation of self, we are actually using this energy in a lawful fashion. We're not misusing it. So in that moment when we are really sensing ourselves, we are using C12 in its lawful fashion, and it cannot be misused in that moment. But that moment, just we lose it, and then we get back into our normal life. So another way to fight the ego, is to bring our awareness back into our body as often as we can, knowing that when we're doing that, we're actually lawfully using this energy for its proper purpose, and it's not being siphoned away by the other parts of our being. Any other comments? Any other questions before we go? I mean, I've done some very, talked about some very heavy stuff today.
So there's
Okay, Guido, you're again,
you please, you can hear me.
I can kind of hear you. Just ask a question.
Yeah. Would you please set up a homework? Something that is not the 61 exercise, but a weekly homework.
Okay.
So I can do every time I remember myself.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I won't do that now, but I will keep that in my mind, and I will think about it. Guido, set up weekly homework. That's more than just doing the inner work. These different things that we can do. Okay.
Please. Thank you.
Okay. It's almost noon. I've got a client coming in half an hour. Thank the two of you for being here, and
Thank you so much.
take care.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.